It was a typical day at the airport, and the hustle and bustle of people moving around created a buzzing atmosphere. Travelers hurried through the security checkpoints, dragging their luggage behind them. The air was filled with the sounds of conversations, children laughing, and the occasional announcement echoing through the terminal. For most passengers, it was just another trip, whether for business or pleasure. But for one young family, this ordinary morning was about to turn into something truly extraordinary. Lily, a 3-year-old girl with big, curious eyes and an infectious smile, had never been to an airport before. She stood hand in hand with her parents, her gaze moving from one thing to the next, taking in everything with wonder. She wasn't the kind of child to be easily intimidated by her surroundings. In fact, she was a little adventurer, always excited to explore the world around her. Today, the airport was her new playground. Her parents were busy with their tickets, checking in, and making sure they had everything they needed for the flight. But for Lily, it was all about the experience. She loved to point out things she had never seen before, and today she was on a mission to notice everything. As the family made their way toward the gate, something caught Lily's eye. Near the security checkpoint, a police officer walked alongside a large German shepherd, the dog's leash held firmly in his hand. Lily stopped in her tracks and stared at the pair. The dog, standing tall and alert, seemed like a creature from another world. The officer, calm and steady, kept his eyes scanning the crowd, paying no mind to the curious onlookers. To most people, this was just part of the daily routine at the airport. The K9 unit was often seen patrolling, ensuring the safety of passengers and their belongings. But to Lily, the dog was the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. Her eyes widened and she instinctively pointed toward the dog. "That's Max," she said, her little voice clear and confident. Her parents, who had been chatting with each other, looked down at her in surprise. They hadn't said anything to her about the dog, nor had they mentioned the officer's presence. They both exchanged puzzled glances. How did Lily know the dog's name? Lily's parents didn't immediately react, thinking it was just a coincidence. It was possible, they reasoned, that she had heard someone mention the dog's name earlier and was simply repeating it. After all, children at that age were like sponges, absorbing words and names from their surroundings without always understanding their context. But there was something about the way Lily said it that seemed different. She wasn't guessing, nor was she trying to make something up. She said it with such certainty, as if she had known the dog for years. The officer, however, seemed to notice the moment as well. He glanced at the little girl with a raised eyebrow. It wasn't uncommon for children to be intrigued by police dogs, but hearing Lily speak the dog's name, especially when no one had introduced her to Max, made him pause. He looked at his partner, who was nearby, then back at the family. The officer's curiosity got the best of him, so he walked over to them, his hand resting lightly on Max's leash. "Excuse me," the officer said, his tone friendly but intrigued. How did she know his name? Lily's parents were momentarily stunned. They had no idea how Lily had learned the dog's name. They looked at each other, trying to piece together any possible explanation. "We haven't mentioned the dog to her," the mother replied, still baffled. "I don't know where she would have heard the name Max." The officer kneeled down to Lily's level, his expression softening. "Do you know the dog?" he asked gently, trying to keep the situation light. He was genuinely curious. There were many times when children pointed at dogs, but this was different. Lily wasn't just pointing at any dog, she was pointing at Max, the airport's K9 unit, a dog that had been part of the team for years. It was highly unusual for anyone to know the dog's name unless they had been around him frequently. Lily, who had been staring intently at Max, didn't answer right away. She continued to gaze at the dog, her small face serious. It was as if she was studying him, looking at him in a way that most people couldn't. After a few moments, she turned to the officer and said, "Max helps keep people safe." The officer blinked, taken aback by the child's words. He hadn't expected such a response. Most people, even adults, wouldn't immediately think of a police dog's role in security. They might have recognized the dog as part of the police force, but they wouldn't know the specifics of his job. For Lily, though, it seemed as though she understood exactly what Max's purpose was. The officer glanced at his partner again, both of them now feeling the strange shift in the air. How could this little girl, barely old enough to form full sentences, know about Max's job as a police dog? Lily's parents, still trying to make sense of the situation, smiled awkwardly, but there was a sense of unease starting to grow within them. It was a simple statement, but it was one that felt much deeper than anything they had experienced in their short time as parents. "She's a bit of an imaginative one," her father said, trying to explain away the oddness of the moment. "She loves dogs, so I guess she just made up a name for him." But the officer wasn't so sure. He could tell that Lily wasn't just making up a story. She wasn't speaking in the way a child would when pretending. She was speaking with an understanding that went beyond her years. The officer looked down at Max, who was still standing perfectly still, his eyes alert but calm. He had worked with Max for 2 years and knew the dog's every move. Max had been part of many important operations, sniffing out potential threats, drugs and explosives. He had saved lives and helped keep the airport a safer place. But there was something about this moment that felt different. The officer knelt even lower, trying to connect with the child. "Lily, where did you learn that?" he asked softly. "Do you know Max from somewhere?" Lily's parents looked on, feeling a bit uncomfortable but unsure of how to react. Lily didn't answer right away. She simply smiled and said again, "Max helps keep people safe." Her voice was calm, almost as if she was sharing a simple fact. The officer looked at her, then at Max, who had turned his head slightly toward the little girl. There was no indication that Max had heard the conversation or that he understood the situation, but the officer couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was happening. He decided to let it go for now. There were many things in life that couldn't be explained, and sometimes it was better to accept that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. But as Lily and her family continued walking toward the gate, the officer couldn't help but feel a strange connection between the little girl and the dog. It was as if their paths had crossed in some deeper, inexplicable way. And even though Lily was just a child, the officer couldn't shake the thought that there was more to this story than anyone realized. The officer stood there, still kneeling down in front of Lily, his curiosity growing stronger by the second. He could tell that there was something special about this little girl, something beyond the innocent words she had spoken. It wasn't just that she had known the dog's name. It was how she had said it with such certainty, as though she had been familiar with Max for a long time, even though they had never met before. The officer felt a mixture of awe and confusion. He had seen a lot in his years of service, but this was something he couldn't easily explain. Lily's parents, still standing a few steps behind, exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't sure how to respond to the officer's questions. They hadn't heard anything that would explain Lily's knowledge of the police dog. They certainly hadn't mentioned Max to her, nor did they think she had any reason to know the dog's name. It was all so strange, and the fact that the officer was so intrigued only made them feel more uncomfortable. They had come to the airport for a simple flight, but now, this odd encounter was beginning to feel like something more than just a chance meeting. The officer, after a moment of hesitation, stood up straight, brushing the dust from his uniform. He looked at Max, who was still standing calmly by his side. The dog's dark eyes locked on Lily as though he too was trying to understand what was going on. Max's stillness was impressive, but it also added to the tension in the air. It was as if the dog was waiting for something to happen, something that the officer couldn't quite put his finger on. "Do you know him?" the officer asked again, his voice now softer, more curious than before. He was no longer just asking for an explanation. He was asking for something deeper, something that might explain why Lily had said what she did. He crouched down to her level once again, making sure not to startle her. He wanted to make sure that Lily felt comfortable, even though she had already made an impact on him. Lily didn't respond at first. She was still looking at Max, her finger still pointed at the dog as if she had forgotten the officer was even there. The little girl's focus was so intense that the officer wondered if there was something more going on, something that no one else in the room could see. The more he watched her, the more it seemed like Lily wasn't just observing Max the way a child would watch a dog. No, it was as if she recognized him, like she had known him before. Finally, Lily spoke again, her voice as calm as it had been before. Max is special. He's always been my friend. The officer felt a chill run through him as the words sank in. This wasn't just a child making an innocent comment. Lily's words carried weight, as if she was talking about something far beyond what a 3-year-old should know. The officer's mind raced. Could Lily have somehow known about the K-9 unit? Was she somehow connected to Max's past in a way that no one could explain? He glanced at her parents, who were now looking at each other with a mixture of confusion and concern. It was clear that they were just as puzzled by Lily's words as he was. They had no idea where this was coming from. "Your daughter seems to have quite the imagination," the officer said, trying to lighten the mood. But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. Lily's statement about being friends with Max, it didn't make sense. How could she know that the dog had always been by her side? How could she at her young age have this level of awareness? The officer stood up again, giving Max a quick pat on the head. The dog remained still, his eyes never leaving Lily's. "I've never seen anything quite like this," the officer admitted, almost to himself. His partner, who had been standing off to the side, now joined him. His partner had been busy watching the scene unfold, but now he too could see the odd connection between the girl and the dog. There was something more here, something they couldn't explain, but they both felt it in their gut. "We should probably let her go," the officer's partner suggested, trying to move the situation along. But the officer was reluctant. He felt drawn to the moment, almost like it was a puzzle that needed solving. There was an intuition in him telling him that Lily's words weren't just some random statement. He didn't know what it meant, but there was a deeper meaning lurking beneath the surface. The officer took one last look at Lily, who was still pointing at Max. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, but something in her gaze told him that there was more to this story than met the eye. As he stood up to walk away, he couldn't help but glance back over his shoulder at the little girl and her parents. They were still standing near the security checkpoint, chatting with each other, oblivious to the strange energy that had filled the air. For the rest of the day, the officer couldn't shake the memory of that encounter. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's face, so innocent yet so wise in a way that made him uneasy. How did she know Max's name? How did she know that he was special? It wasn't just a coincidence. That much was clear. The officer thought about it as he walked back to the K-9 unit office. The case didn't make sense, but it stuck with him. There was something about it that he couldn't let go of. Meanwhile, Lily's parents had started to feel more and more uncomfortable with the situation. They couldn't explain it, but they were beginning to sense that something unusual had happened. It wasn't every day that their daughter made comments like the one she had just made. She had always been a curious child, always asking questions and pointing out things that intrigued her, but this was different. How could she know about Max? Why had she said that he was always her friend? The more they thought about it, the more they realized that Lily's behavior wasn't the same as it usually was. There was something almost mystical about it. They continued on with their day, but the encounter at the airport stayed with them. They couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than just an innocent moment. As they boarded their flight, Lily seemed perfectly happy, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. She played with her toys, chatted with her parents, and even fell asleep during the flight. But her parents, looking at their daughter as she slept peacefully, couldn't help but wonder if their little girl had just opened a door to something bigger than they could understand. And for the officer and his partner, the mystery of Lily's connection to Max was one that would linger in their minds for days to come. The officer couldn't stop thinking about the little girl and her strange connection to Max. What had happened at the airport earlier that day kept replaying in his mind, over and over again. He found himself walking in circles in the small break room, running his fingers through his hair as he tried to make sense of the whole situation. The way Lily had looked at Max, the way she had spoken, so sure, so certain of herself. It didn't make sense. She was only 3 years old, and yet she had spoken about Max as though they were old friends. It was as if she knew things that no one had told her. How could that be? He thought back to their brief conversation at the airport. Lily's parents had seemed just as confused as he was, though they were trying their best to brush it off as nothing more than an innocent child's imagination. But the officer couldn't let it go. There was something too unsettling about it. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Lily's words weren't just a random observation. She had said that Max helped keep people safe. How did she know that? Did she understand what a police dog did? It was hard to believe that a 3-year-old would know about something as specific as airport security, and the role a police dog played. It wasn't common knowledge, after all. Most people didn't give much thought to the K9 units patrolling the airport, even if they noticed them. He knew it wasn't just a lucky guess either. Children at Lily's age typically don't make statements like that without any foundation for it. They could repeat things they'd heard, or they might come up with stories, but the way Lily had spoken was different. She had said it with the kind of certainty that you only find when someone knows something deeply. And what about the fact that she called the dog by his name, Max? That wasn't a name anyone would have guessed unless they had been told, and the officer was sure that no one had mentioned it in front of Lily. The more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. He had to know more. There had to be something that tied Lily to Max, something beyond mere coincidence. Could it be possible that she had somehow picked up on information without even realizing it? Or was there something more mysterious happening? Something that went beyond what the officer could explain? The officer decided to dig deeper. After all, as a member of the K9 unit, it was his job to keep an eye on things, to investigate when things didn't add up. And this certainly didn't add up. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number of his partner, who had been standing nearby during the encounter with Lily. "Hey, it's me," the officer said when his partner picked up. "I've been thinking about that girl, the one with the, family at the security checkpoint." "Yeah, I've been thinking about that too," his partner replied. "It's strange, right?" "It's more than strange," the officer said. "How did she know the dog's name? And how did she know Max's role here at the airport? I can't stop thinking about it." "I know, right? It's like she wasn't just guessing or making up a story. It felt like she had been around K9 units before, or at least knew about them." "Exactly," the officer replied. "That's what's bothering me. Kids don't usually talk like that, not about something like this." His partner paused for a moment. "What are you thinking? Should we look into it? See if there's a connection?" "I think we have to," the officer said. "We need to find out more about that family, especially the girl. Maybe we can figure out where she learned about Max." His partner agreed, and they decided to start investigating. The officer took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of anticipation and unease. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than just a random comment from a child. He had been a police officer long enough to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him that there was something unusual at play, something that couldn't be ignored. The officer made his way back to the airport security office. He knew they had surveillance footage of the security checkpoint and the surrounding areas. If Lily and her family had spent some time near the K9 unit, there might be something on the footage that could provide a clue. The officer hoped that by reviewing the video, they might be able to uncover some sort of connection between Lily and Max, something that explained how she knew the dog's name and role. As he sat down in front of the monitors, he felt a growing sense of urgency. The footage started rolling, showing passengers walking through the checkpoint, people passing by Max, and the officer doing his usual rounds with the dog. There were no obvious clues at first, just the usual hustle and bustle of the airport. But as the video continued, the officer's attention snapped to one moment. Just a few minutes before the encounter with Lily, he saw the family walking through the terminal with Lily holding her mother's hand. They had passed right by Max and the officer without pausing. There was nothing in the video that suggested they had been near the dog for long, but then something caught the officer's eye. In the background, just as the family passed by, there was a brief exchange between another officer and the K9 handler. The officer appeared to be discussing something in front of a small group of people. But the officer didn't focus on that. What caught his attention was that just before the family walked past, there was a brief moment where Lily had turned her head and stared at Max, almost like she had recognized him. It wasn't an ordinary glance. It was more like a knowing look, one that made the officer's heart race. Could it be that Lily had seen Max before, perhaps somewhere else? Or was this just a strange coincidence? The officer wasn't sure, but the feeling in his gut told him that this wasn't just a random event. The more he watched, the more he felt that Lily and Max were connected in some way, though he couldn't quite put it into words. It was like there was something hidden, something that the officer couldn't quite reach, but he could feel it tugging at him, urging him to dig deeper. As the video ended, the officer leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He had to admit there was no clear explanation for what had happened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfolding here, something that needed to be understood. He knew he couldn't let this go. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his partner. "I found something interesting. Meet me outside in 10 minutes. The officer's heart skipped a beat. Whatever his partner had found, it was important. He stood up quickly, feeling the weight of the mystery settle deeper on his shoulders. Whatever was going on with Lily and Max, the officer knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to be easy to figure out. But he had to try. Something told him that the answers were out there waiting to be uncovered. He walked out of the security office, his mind racing. The case was far from over, and there was still so much left to discover. And as he stepped outside to meet his partner, the officer couldn't help but feel that the strange connection between Lily and Max was just the beginning of a story that was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. 2. The officer met his partner outside the security office, his mind still racing with questions. He had barely had time to process everything he had seen on the surveillance footage. There was something in Lily's gaze, something unexplainable, about the way she had looked at Max that kept nagging at him. He felt a strange urgency, as though the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but he still couldn't quite see the whole picture. "What did you find?" the officer asked, eager to know what his partner had uncovered. His partner had been digging into the records of the K9 unit and trying to trace any connection that might explain Lily's strange knowledge of Max. His partner pulled out his phone and tapped a few buttons before handing it to the officer. "Look at this," he said, his voice low. On the screen was a record of the missing person report from a few years ago. It was a case involving a little girl who had gone missing at the airport, and Max had been involved in the search. The officer scanned the details quickly, but his heart skipped when he saw the name of the girl. Sarah. Sarah had gone missing in the airport when she was about the same age as Lily, 3 years old. The report stated that Sarah had wandered off, and when her parents couldn't find her, they alerted security. Max, the very same dog who had been standing with the officer that day, had been called in to help. The story was familiar to the officer. He remembered the case. Max had been instrumental in finding the little girl. The story had been all over the news at the time because it was such a relief when Sarah was safely found after a long search. But there was something even more unusual in the report. It mentioned that Sarah had in some way guided Max to her location. The officer read the sentence over and over again. Sarah had guided Max to her location. How was that possible? He had never heard anything like it before. Dogs like Max were trained to sniff out scents, not follow the lead of children. But the report clearly said that Sarah, who had been trapped in a storage room, had somehow communicated with Max in a way that led him to her. The officer looked up at his partner. "This can't be a coincidence," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. The missing girl's name was Sarah. She was about Lily's age, and Max helped find her. But the report says that Sarah guided Max to her. How is that even possible? His partner nodded slowly, his face serious. "I know. It doesn't make sense, but it's what the report says. And it gets stranger when you think about how Lily was so sure about Max's role as a police dog, how she knew his name. Maybe there's more to this connection than we realize." The officer's mind was spinning. Could it be that Lily had somehow picked up on a memory from Sarah's past, Could there be some kind of connection between the two girls that was beyond what they could understand? The more he thought about it, the more the whole thing seemed impossible, but the coincidences were too strong to ignore. There was something happening here that was far beyond ordinary. He looked at his partner again. We need to find out more about Sarah. Maybe we can learn something about the case that will explain what's going on with Lily. His partner agreed. I'll dig into the case files and see if there's anything more about Sarah's connection. To Max, you should talk to the parents, see if there's anything they know that could help explain this. The officer nodded, feeling a sense of purpose rising inside him. He had to get to the bottom of this. He had seen enough strange things in his career to know that sometimes things didn't just happen by chance. Sometimes there were connections that couldn't be explained, but they were real nonetheless. The officer made his way to the family's gate, where Lily and her parents were sitting, waiting for their flight. As he approached, he saw Lily playing quietly with her toy, her parents chatting softly to each other. The scene was calm, almost peaceful. It felt so ordinary, and yet the officer knew that what had happened just hours earlier was anything but ordinary. He approached the family with a polite smile. "Excuse me," he said, his tone friendly but purposeful. "I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to ask you a few more questions about your daughter. I've been thinking about our conversation earlier, and there's something that I'd like to understand better." Lily's parents looked up at him, clearly still a little unsure of the whole situation. The officer noticed the slight tension in their posture. They were obviously wondering why he had returned after their brief exchange, but they nodded politely, giving him permission to ask more questions. The officer turned to Lily, who was still focused on her toy. "Lily," he said gently, "do you remember talking to me earlier today? About Max?" Lily looked up, her big, brown eyes meeting the officer's gaze. She smiled brightly as though she hadn't a care in the world. "Max helps keep people safe," she said matter-of-factly, as if repeating something she had already said 100 times. The officer felt a cold shiver run through him. How did she know that? It was the same thing she had said earlier. He turned to her parents, who were watching their daughter with a mix of confusion and concern. "We've never really talked about Max, or even police dogs in general," Lily's mother said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "She's always been a curious child, but we've never mentioned any of this to her. It's all a bit strange, to be honest." The officer nodded. He could sense their unease, but there was no mistaking it. Something unusual was happening, and the connections were starting to pile up. "You said you've never mentioned Max before. Do you know if Lily has seen a police dog before, maybe on TV or at another airport?" Lily's father shook his head. "No, nothing like that. She's never shown this kind of interest in a dog before. I don't know where it's coming from." The officer felt an odd sense of satisfaction, though it was mixed with growing uncertainty. It seemed like Lily hadn't picked up her knowledge of Max from any obvious source. The way she spoke about the dog, about his role in keeping people safe, was coming from a place he couldn't yet understand. It was as though she was speaking from experience, not from something she had learned from a book or a story. "Have you heard of a missing persons case from a few years ago?" the officer asked cautiously, glancing between the parents. "A little girl named Sarah. She was around Lily's age at the time, and Max was involved in the search." Lily's parents exchanged an uneasy look. "We've heard of it," her father said quietly. "It was all over the news back then. I remember that they found her safe, but that's about all we know." The officer hesitated for a moment. Could there be some connection between Sarah's disappearance and Lily's strange knowledge of Max? It was a stretch, but it seemed to be the only clue that made sense. He needed more answers. But for now, the officer knew that he had to tread carefully. "We'll keep looking into this," the officer said, giving them a reassuring smile. "Thank you for your time, and if you remember anything else, please let us know." As he walked away, the officer's mind was swirling with thoughts. The more he uncovered, the more the mystery deepened. Could Lily and Sarah somehow be connected? In ways that went beyond the ordinary? And what about Max? How did he fit into all of this? The pieces were slowly coming together, but the officer knew that he wasn't anywhere near the truth yet. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that this was just the beginning of a story that would lead him into unexpected, unexplainable places. The officer couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had learned so far was leading him to a truth that was just beyond his reach. The strange connection between Lily and Max was not something he could easily ignore. Every time he thought, he had come closer to understanding the mystery. Something else came up that deepened his confusion. He had always relied on facts, evidence, and logic in his career. But this situation was different. The more he tried to make sense of it, the more questions seemed to arise. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a random coincidence. As the days passed, the officer continued to dig into the case. He revisited the missing person report about Sarah, the girl who had gone missing years ago and had somehow guided Max to her location. There was something so unusual about that detail that it kept gnawing at him. He knew Max, and he knew how highly trained the dog was. For a child to somehow lead Max, especially a young child who was scared and alone, it didn't make sense. Max was trained to use his senses to find people, not to follow the lead of someone else. The officer had never encountered anything like it before, and the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the answer was hidden somewhere in the past. One morning, the officer received a call from his partner. "I think I found something," his partner said, sounding urgent. "You need to see this." The officer immediately headed to the K9 unit office, where his partner had found something that might shed more light on the connection between Lily and Sarah. When he arrived, his partner handed him a folder containing a stack of old papers. "This is a transcript from an interview with Sarah's parents," his partner explained. "It's from when they were trying to figure out what happened the day Sarah disappeared." The officer sat down, his heart racing, and began flipping through the papers. The transcript detailed the interview with Sarah's parents after her rescue. They had been asked about Sarah's behavior during the incident, and what they said made the officer's blood run cold. According to the transcript, Sarah had described an invisible friend who had been with her in the storage room. This friend had helped her stay calm and had even guided her to the door where Max found her. The parents had dismissed it at the time as something a child might say when scared, but it was there in the interview. Sarah had talked about a friend who was with her, who seemed to know exactly what to do. The officer's mind raced. Could this invisible friend be Max? Or was it something else entirely? The officer leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning with the possibilities. There had to be a connection between Sarah's story and Lily's strange knowledge of Max. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like Lily wasn't just remembering the past. She wasn't repeating something she had overheard. It was as if she had a deeper understanding of the situation, something that went beyond her years, something that linked her to the past in ways no one could explain. Determined to get to the bottom of this, the officer decided to speak with Lily's parents again. He needed to know if there was anything they hadn't told him, anything they had missed. When he arrived at the airport, he found them waiting near the gate. The family had another flight to catch, but they agreed to meet with him for a few minutes. "Thank you for taking the time to talk with me again," the officer began, trying to keep his tone calm. He didn't want to scare them, but he needed more information. "I've been looking into the missing person case from a few years ago, and there's something about it that keeps coming up. I know it's a long shot, but I have to ask, has Lily ever mentioned anything about an invisible friend?" Lily's parents exchanged a glance, their faces showing the same uncertainty the officer had seen before. "An invisible friend?" Lily's mother asked, clearly puzzled. "No, she's never mentioned anything like that. She's always had a great imagination, but she's never talked about anything like that." The officer nodded, trying to keep his disappointment in check. "Okay, that's helpful, but I need to ask, has she ever shown an interest in the story of Sarah, the little girl who went missing here a few years ago?" Lily's father frowned, clearly trying to recall anything that could help. "I'm not sure. We don't really talk about those kinds of stories with her. She's so young, we try to shield her from things like that. The officer could see that they were being honest. There was no sign that Lily had any knowledge of the story or the circumstances surrounding Sarah's disappearance, but it didn't make sense. How could she have known so much about Max? How could she have connected with the dog in such an intimate way? He was convinced that the answers were somewhere in this family's past, something they weren't aware of but which Lily had somehow picked up on. "I understand," the officer said, his voice softening. "Thank you for your time. I know this is strange, and I appreciate your cooperation." As he turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel like he was chasing shadows. He had so many pieces of the puzzle, but none of them seemed to fit. Lily's connection to Max, the strange words she had spoken, the story of Sarah and her invisible friend. It was all so tangled up, and he couldn't figure out how it all connected. But one thing was becoming clearer with each passing day. This wasn't just a coincidence. There was something more at play, something that was stretching the boundaries of what the officer had always believed was possible. A few days later, as the officer sat at his desk reviewing more paperwork, his phone rang. It was his partner again. "You won't believe this," his partner said, sounding almost breathless. "I think I've found something that explains it all." The officer's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward. "What is it? What did you find?" "Remember Sarah's story about the invisible friend?" his partner asked. "I found something in her old medical records. It's not much, but it's enough to make us think." Sarah had been seeing a therapist shortly before she went missing. The therapist had notes about a recurring dream Sarah had, about a dog, a friendly dog who kept her safe. The dream was so vivid that Sarah talked about it during their sessions. And get this, the dog in her dream had a name, Max. The officer felt the room spin as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. It wasn't just that Sarah had guided Max. It was that she had been connected to him in her dreams. She had seen Max before, long before the day he had found her, and somehow that connection had transcended into reality. It was the same connection that Lily had experienced, the same way she had known about Max. The officer sat back, taking it all in. This was something he had never encountered before, something beyond any explanation he could grasp. But now, he finally understood. Lily wasn't just a child with a vivid imagination. She wasn't just repeating things she had heard. She had somehow tapped into a memory of a little girl who had been saved by Max years ago. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a ghost. It was something much more mysterious, a connection between the past and the present, between two little girls and a dog who had kept them safe. The officer knew that he would never forget this case, this strange and inexplicable connection that had crossed the boundaries of time and space. And as he walked away from the K-9 unit, he couldn't help but wonder if there were other mysteries out there, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered.